Welcome to Commander Center, episode 282, and today we're going to be taking a look at what we look for and change in our decks after playing our first couple of games with a brand new list. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Gentlemen, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm sleepy.
Did you have a late night or something, Chris?
I always have late nights. I'm not the greatest of sleepers, so today is just kind of bleh.
I have definitely been there. I think Max and I both have quiet afternoons ahead of us here, so we're just kind of enjoying the fact that there's not a busy workday ahead of us.
Ha ha! It must be nice, jerks.
You have a busy work night.
I don't know how busy it's going to be. Quite a few of our players are gone because there's a rare draft in somewhere in Illinois, past Rockford, for a Mox Ruby is first place prize.
Wow. Nice.
So I mean,
it's the myth. Is it the all rare or all mythic draft?
I think it's all rare. It's one of those two. But that's what they're going down to do. Is quite a few of them are gone. So our main draft crowd won't be here. I mean, but we've been getting a lot of new people. So I'm actually hoping just to be able to go sit down and draft. That's my goal tonight. So I don't have to deal with customers. I just want draft cards. And
you don't have to actually hold hands. You can actually just sit down and draft some Forgotten Realms, I'm guessing?
Yeah, because I've done it online quite a few times. I haven't done it in paper yet. And it seems like a fun draft format. The overall set is horrible and constructed, but as a draft format, it looks sweet.
Cool. Well, Max, I know you were waiting on new cards to show up for, was it for a new deck you're building?
No, just updates to my existing decks. Yeah.
Did those ever arrive for you yet?
Tracking says Monday, so
okay, all right.
They should be ready for Tuesday.
Nice.
Yep, they'll be here in 3 weeks. Don't worry.
Yeah, they'll get sent back and sent back again. You know.
Well, Max ordered a video game accessory and messaged me yesterday. It was like, it was supposed to be here today, and now it's showing us in Memphis, Tennessee. and then an hour later, it's at your house, right?
Yep. So
yeah.
FedEx tracking like it. I don't know what happened. It was out for delivery. Tracking said out for delivery in Eau Claire at 9 in the morning. Checked it that afternoon. Out for delivery in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm like, they did that really quick. Like, I wish I could get to Memphis in 2 hours. But no, I think it was just a goof in their system, and eventually it showed up perfectly fine, and I was very happy with it.
Nice.
Well, that's good.
Well, I get to play a few games at our shop this week. That's always a good time, and it's been getting pretty busy in there. I mean, I bet we had 30-some people playing Commander this week. That's a pretty solid turnout for a Tuesday night in the summer, especially.
Yeah, so, I mean, no school around yet, so
right,
I'm sure we'll only get an influx once the university starts having students back here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's cool to see people are back playing.
Had it definitely been that, because I think we had 27 who actually signed up for Event Link, so we can put in numbers as to how many players we have in the store and whatnot. So yeah, it had to have been over 30.
I did play a game with a real young kid. I mean, he was maybe 14 years old, and I would guess perhaps younger than that.
I can't think of his name neither, because he's an awesome kid, and I love him a lot.
I feel like I was told this story last night.
Well, he was playing a mono-red Dragons deck, but the commander was Tuk for whatever reason. But really early on, one of the other players dropped a Aethersworn, or no, what's the 1-drop white draw creature? I've just forgotten the name of it. The new one.
Esper Sentinel.
There we go. Esper Sentinel. And he immediately bolts it with the lightning bolt in his mono-red deck. And then
bolt the bird, kill it.
That's exactly what everyone said, and everyone just laughed, including the guy who played Esper Sentinel. And then later on, he somehow recurred. I can't remember what happened. If there was a wheel that came out and he shuffled his, everyone's library got shuffled back into their, or graveyard got shuffled back in, or what. But he replayed the Esper Sentinel again, 8 turns later, and the kid immediately hit it with something else. It wasn't a shock or something, but hit it with some other removal spell. And again, everyone's just like, yeah, all right, you took care of the problem. Good job. It was super fun. He was a lot of fun to play with, and played very efficiently and professionally. It was super cool.
Yeah, I really wish I could think of his name, because it's the same kid I'm thinking of. I ran into him and his dad at Shields the other day too. And they're big into the outdoors like I am, so it's kind of awesome to see people who aren't all just, straight up nerds and love playing games, but they have other hobbies as well.
Yeah, so that was fun. I had a good experience there. So if you out there in listener land had some fun games you played, or just something interesting you'd like to share, how would you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can find us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter by searching CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com. You can find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central. And you can also find us on YouTube by searching, you guessed it, CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDRCentral. Check out our reward tiers, such as a Decks You Play episode, or just joining our community to chat and play virtual EDH with all of us.
Well, and speaking of community supporters, we have a couple of giveaways this month. We're giving away one of the Ultra Pro Chandra Alt Art playmats from War of the Spark and a Heroes of Dominaria board game. The playmat will be given away to someone on Twitter who likes and retweets a tweet that we will send out when the show goes live. And anyone who's done that by the end of August will be registered to get that playmat. And any Patreon supporter by the end of August at any tier will be registered for a chance to win that Heroes of Dominaria board game. So thank you to Andrew Nolan for providing those to us, and thanks to everyone for supporting us, whether it's through Patreon or just by listening to the show and upvoting and liking us. It means a lot and does a lot to help keep the show out there and keep the lights on. So thank you to Andrew and thank you to everyone. Should we jump into the main topic here? Because there's not much news. I think we do have a big event here coming up, I think in about 2 weeks, where they're going to reveal essentially the next year worth of products, basically, right? That's sometime towards the end of August, but we're not there yet. It's been pretty quiet building up to that, so not any real news. So let's just kind of jump into this and talk about the things we do and look for when we build a new deck, particularly those first couple games. Once you've built it, got it in paper, played those first few games, because that's when you first see the big things you need to tweak and change. I don't talk about that and things we do there. And the first thing I will mention is kind of a general category. When I come home from that first night where I'll play a deck, once or twice, I ask myself what the deck kind of generically felt like it wanted. That's the first thing that jumps out at me. Did I want more ramp? Did I want more draw? Did I want more removal? What kind of, in a general sense, did a deck feel like I just didn't balance correctly when I first put it together, and now I need to tweak that a little bit? The big things that tend to jump out at me are draw and removal. Did I have enough answers to things, and did I have enough ways to put cards back into my hand? So for me, those are the two things that tend to jump out. Ramp less so. I usually do an okay job there, but draw and removal are the ones I really keep an eye on, and almost always tend to tweak those numbers upwards and add more draw and more removal once I take that deck out for its first test drive. Is there anything that you guys tend to encounter there when you first play a deck where you're looking, what buttons do you look to turn in terms of like the amount of cards there?
Well, the first thing that I do is I don't even worry about, changing my deck unless I get about 5 or 6 games in with it.
Okay.
It's the very first thing, because you don't know how the deck plays until you get X amount of games in with it.
Sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Chris. I try, if I know I'm bringing a new deck to the shop or to wherever I'm playing, I want to get at least a half a dozen games in before I even contemplate making any changes.
Okay.
But I kind of am the same boat as you, though, Dana. Once I have played enough games, I kind of start at, okay, where were my shortcomings? What did I not have enough of? And sometimes it's removal, sometimes it's board wipe, sometimes it's creatures. Maybe I just don't run enough bodies, or I didn't see them enough. So yeah, I definitely start at what didn't the deck do versus what does the deck do well.
See, I usually run into an issue more of having too much of the stuff versus not having enough of it.
For sure, that can sometimes be a thing. A good example of that would be, and see, some of that isn't even just how you built it, it's how the deck plays. An example of that is I built that, I've mentioned here before, the budget elf deck I put together, just to bring with and lend to people if they need it. I built that deck kind of with the traditional, I'm going to run, this many ramp spells, this many removal spells, like I usually do with any deck. However, it being an elf deck means that there's Llanowar elves in it, and Vinhorn elves, and wood elves, and a bunch of creatures, way more creatures than I usually run in a deck that also provide ramp. Additionally, the commander's Marwyn, who also taps for mana. So I just found that the deck produced way more mana than I could ever use, and I was never there was nothing there. Sometimes you could say, okay, well, I'll put something in the deck to sink that mana into. The way the deck is built and the budget level it's at, there's just not mana sinks of the level that it would be required to use that much mana. So instead, I just pulled some of that ramp out, the ramp and growth kind of effects. I still have a few of those in there, but way less than I did initially, because that deck had too much ramp because of the way the deck was constructed.
Yeah, well, also the mana curve on elves is so low that you don't really need something like that.
Exactly. Yep, that's another one too, yeah. And again, I'm usually playing with a deck that has a higher mana curve. Just by accident, that deck's got I think it's under 2, because there's so many 1-drop elves in it. So yeah, that's another one too. That also threw off how much ramp I wanted. I had too much compared to what the deck needed. But it's one of those things you don't really realize until you actually get reps in. Like, you just have to play a deck sometimes. I'm probably more impatient than you guys. Like, I hit 5 or 6 games more than I like to start making changes after, probably 2 or 3, which is probably actually not as good. I would probably be better served to be a little more patient, but we're all kind of on the same page there.
I usually play the same deck, though, repeatedly as well. Like, when you sit down, and it's a new deck, a lot of times when you're playing, you switch out decks. When you go to another pod or a new game, I'll play the same deck repeatedly. And even if it's against the same opponents and they've already seen how the deck plays and they understand it, just because I want them to go as hard as they can against me, knowing what's going on so I can see where the shortcomings are.
Absolutely. When I build a new one, I try to get as many reps in as I can that first week or two, just because, it's first of all, it's a new toy, but also, you want to get a feel for it quickly.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just because, like, if I show up with a new deck, there's a few things I want to do at the shop. I want to play with people who know I'm playing a new deck. I want to play with you, Chris, you, Dana, you, Chris, Dr. Mike, or Ben. I want to play with people that know that, hey, this is a new deck, and I'm not telling them to pull punches, but I'm also not walking in blind to a pod where I'm extremely, outpowered even after a Rule 0 conversation.
Right.
I want to work my way up to, like, okay, now let's try a more tuned deck of yours or whatnot. I don't mind losing a bunch of games, but I also just don't want my first game with that brand new deck to run into, like, Brawl 99 counterspell deck and, Reki History of Kamigawa or whatnot.
Where you don't get a chance to play it. Or the opposite, where you have incorrectly guessed what the power level is because you haven't played it before, and you wind up stomping somebody because it just blows up 2 or 3 games in a row because you're like, oh, I didn't really realize how powerful this was, which is a thing I've hit once in a while before too. That actually can happen. And if you're going to do that, I'd rather do it with somebody than some random stranger when you're like, oh, this is a new deck, and then just stomp them with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Stomp
suppose.
those strangers.
I suppose. I mean, my newest deck, I did go a little ham and stomp a new player, but it just seemed like that was just the game that the deck kicked off, and they didn't interact with me at all.
It
so
does
it's just like I had everything to do in the world.
You can't. I mean, it just happens sometimes.
Yeah, and once you get so far ahead, it's like I might as well just stay ahead and finish the game off faster.
So the first thing I said I kind of do is ask myself what my deck wants in a general sense. The next thing is I try to look at, like, what did the deck want or miss specifically to that particular deck. Every deck wants draw and every deck wants removal for the most part. What a deck itself specifically wants is a whole different thing. And I try to ask myself that question too. And I'll give some concrete examples here of recent decks of mine. So I built that Arden SEO equipment deck, Azorius equipment deck, fairly recently. And one thing I found was, because most board wipes are just creature board wipes, I would get in a position where, on turn 8 or turn 9 or something, someone would cast a board wipe of some sort and kill all the creatures. And then I would be able to come back to my turn, and I could, if I wanted, cast Arden and then re-equip Arden with whatever equipment was still in play, but I couldn't swing. But if I could swing, if I could punch through, I could maybe kill somebody, because all of a sudden I have a commander there that's wearing, 3 swords and something else that could punch somebody in the face for 18 damage if it had haste, but it didn't have haste. So the question is, okay, so how do I take advantage of that? Because that seems really useful when someone board wipes, to be able to re-equip something for free with Arden and then hit them in the face. So do I run a bunch of haste enablers, so I always have one of those available? Well, that sucks a whole bunch of deck slots up too. So I was trying to find this balance there where, how do I take advantage of this little weird thing in this deck where after a board wipe, I could much more quickly rebuild than somebody else. The solution I came to, rather than run a bunch of haste enablers, was to put lands in the deck that could turn into creatures. So instead of worrying about equipping something and giving it haste, I could just turn a land that was already there into a creature and didn't have to worry about haste, and then equip that with Arden, and then swing on and hit somebody. So I found what the deck wanted, and then I just, spent a few days thinking about it and kind of theory crafting ideas, and that's the solution I came up with, was to run creature lands that could turn into creatures and equip with Arden, and then swing in and take somebody out. And of course, then after testing that out, what I discovered was, if the land cost too much mana to turn into a creature, then I didn't oftentimes have enough mana to both cast Arden and turn the creature into a land. I'm thinking Drinking of Celestial Colonnade. That seems like a really good land to use in that case.
5 mana, though.
But if I'm spending like 5 or 7 mana to recast Arden, and then having to turn Celestial Colonnade or the new Cave of the Frost Dragon into a creature, then I found myself in positions where I really couldn't turn them into creatures. So the ones I kept in the deck were Inkmoth Nexus, Blinkmoth Nexus, and Fairy Conclave, because they cost 1 or 2 mana to turn into creatures, and then I could equip them. And on top of that, all 3 of those have evasion too. They all have flying. So, and 2 of them don't tap when they come into play. Inkmoth Nexus and Blinkmoth Nexus just come into play untapped. So, first of all, I found this thing that I wanted, and then after I tinkered with that, I found the tweak I had to make to that. So that's a recent example of something where I built a new deck and, afterwards asked myself, after I played, okay, what specific thing did I notice when I played this deck that I wanted to work on? Is there anything like that with you guys that you can think of where, like, after playing a new deck, you then realize this is what I want to do that I didn't really think about before I actually played the deck?
Yes. Because the newest deck I built was, well, I suppose Spiders and Dragons approach, and Spiders still gets tweaked to the point where I want it to remain weak. So it's more of when I play something, it's like, ooh, that was too strong. I need to dial that back and find something different for it. But for when I did the Dragons approach, it was very similar to that, where it's like, okay, so I can do so many things, but I can't do so many things at the same time. So I had to find that balance of like where I wanted to take it, which landed me on Kaikar, so I can create tokens whenever I cast a Dragon's approach. So I have something else to do with the deck instead of just, single-mindedly focusing on one thing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think one of my examples would be my Regnum Craft deck is still a work in progress, I would say. I mean, all EDH decks are a work in progress,
Sure.
but like originally it was, okay, I want to just make a bunch of tokens. So I ran all the sorcery speed token makers that, make 2 1/1 spirits or something. And that kind of just wasn't cutting it because, those are 2 mana, 3 mana spells. You can only do so much of that a turn, and then you just kind of set yourself up for a board wipe. So then I moved on to I should factor in more life gain into this deck. So I switched it more to the Soul Sister and Soul Attendant, all those type of cards that when the tokens do enter, I'm gaining incremental life gain, which eventually triggers Regna, and, it's just a giant machine. Well, you can't do much with a 1/1 sitting there. I don't attack with it, I don't block with it. Eventually, Krav might eat it just because I need that extra counter, or I need to draw a card. So now, where I've gotten is, I need to find that happy balance of both. A card that makes tokens and has some sort of life gain on it. So now I'm running a lot of creatures that either care about me gaining the life, something like Silver Smoot Ghoul. So if I gain 3 or more life, it comes back to the battlefield, and then I can sack it to draw a card. Or I run stuff like Wormcoil Engine that has lifelink and makes tokens when it dies or gets eaten by Krav. Twilight Prophet just gains me life and drains my opponent. So I'm starting to find that balance of finding cards that do both things I want at once.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that, sometimes you just need to get reps to get a feel for that. And because there's no hard or fast math you can tell someone to do to come to that conclusion. You just have to play that deck a lot to get that feeling for it too.
Yeah.
I think an extension of this a little bit is once you play that deck out, you can get a feeling for what things work really well, and then maybe look for ways to duplicate those things, but you can't always really tell what things are going to work really well until you play that deck a few times. To use that Arden and Essior deck again, I have wanted to run a couple of the Commander Storm cards before. I've just never had a good deck for them. And those are the ones where you basically copy the spell for every time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. There's, I think, 1 in each color. There's a cycle of 5 of them. But they work especially well with partners because you have twice as many commanders functionally, so odds are you're going to have twice as many of those storm triggers from casting your commander. So I put Echo Storm in that Arden Essior deck to make a copy of an artifact. Again, it's got a ton of equipment. I can equip equipment for free with Arden, so it just seemed like a perfect fit. I would play a sword or something, and I'll have Arden Essior out, and I can cast it, and then it copies twice because I've cast my commanders twice, so I'm suddenly able to make 3 copies of, Sword and War and Peace or something, and then equip those for free with Arden. That seemed really good, and once I tested it out, it in fact was really good, so I was glad I tried that card out. It was so good, in fact, that I decided to, what other ways are there to kind of replicate this powerful effect. So I tried to run Masterful Replication, which turns every artifact you control into a copy of a different artifact to end a turn. Same basic principle. I'm going to turn my mana rocks into, sort of War and Peace or whatever, equip them all for free and swing in and hit somebody. Was even better than Echo Storm. But like, Masterful Replication never occurred to me to be a card to put into that deck until I actually played it a couple times and realized how strong Echo Storm was. So that's another one I look for right away, is like, what things worked and are there other ways to kind of duplicate that effect. Another example, I just built a Jury Master of the Review deck that's built around sacrificing treasures to make Jury big. So when I sacrifice Jury, I punch somebody in the face for 20 damage or something. One of the cards I tried in that deck was Howl from Beyond, which is an old instant from Alpha originally, in black, where it's X and a black, and a creature gets +1/+0 till end of turn for each mana you spend. So a black and 5 pumps it up, +5/+0. The plan being, hey, if someone goes to remove Jury, I can just instant speed, give him, +6/+0 or something, whatever I have for free mana, and deal that much more damage when he dies. Or if I'm in a position where I'm ready to sacrifice him, I can buff him up even more and, deal that much more damage. So when I tried that deck out, I got that card like on the, second game I played, and it worked exactly like I had hoped. It was perfect. Well then, okay, what other cards can I kind of duplicate that with? Well, there's not a ton of them in black, because that was in effect in Alpha. They pretty quickly moved over to red and called Fire Breathing. But I found a card called Hunger of the Nim. It's a sorcery speed for 1 and a black, but a creature you control gets +X/+0 till end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. And in a deck filled with treasures, you can, hey, spend 2 mana and I've got 9 treasures out or something and 3 other artifacts. Well, suddenly Jury's, +12/+0 till end of turn for 2 mana. But it wouldn't have occurred to me to even look for that card if Howl from Beyond hadn't worked so well once I tested it out.
That makes sense.
Are there any examples from you guys where like you play a deck and you find a thing that like really works, or at least it's proved to be working, like you were hoping it would work, and then like, oh, it did work great. And then you look for other ways to do more of that thing.
I can't think of any instances of that, but I'm sure I've ran into it. Like, I'm trying to think really hard if there was anything similar to what you're talking about, and there really isn't.
And I guess Max kind of was talking about that with the life gain effects that he kind of switched to a little bit in his Regnum Craft deck.
Yeah, another thing that I can kind of think about is an early version of Jeremoca. I ran a lot of moat-like effects. So not moat itself, because I couldn't afford the card back then and
Sure.
Can't afford it now. But I ran Magus of the Moat. I ran stuff like, I think it's Bower Passage.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one where creatures with flying can't block creatures I control. Well, all my creatures are flying, and that's kind of the one downside, is if I run into a dragon deck with my Jeremoca deck, I just need to outpace them, where this card was allowing me to get the damage through. As I said, that was an earlier version of the deck. I don't run these cards anymore, but they were definitely something that worked, like kind of what you're explaining. I found something that worked, and I found more cards that did similar effects.
Okay, sure. Now, why did you wind up phasing those out eventually? Did you find you just didn't need the effect that much?
Yeah, I just didn't need the effect. The deck kind of became a slower, grindier deck, so
Sure.
I'm not all aggro-based. And to be honest, I don't run into a lot of all dragon deck or all flying decks either, so 80% of the time, I'm going to be able to hit one of the players in my pod with a creature versus, so they just became dead cards in the deck more often than not, or maybe just they were win more cards, I guess.
Okay, sure.
I don't need to cast this, but I will cast it because, whatever. But yeah, I think they just got phased out because of the way the deck has become a slower, grindier deck, and they just became dead cards.
Well, I think the reason I asked that was because I think that's a thing that you can also sometimes encounter with a new deck, where there's a piece of tech that you think is going to work in the deck, and once you play it, you realize it just isn't that important. And there's a situation where, had you built that Jeremoca deck the way it is right now from the get-go, I would guess that Bower Passage right away, instead of looking for, at the time when it was effective, and looking for more ways to do it, you might have been like, oh, this doesn't really matter for me, so I'm going to take it out. That's something I think you encounter pretty quickly too sometimes, where you just think a thing is going to work, and it winds up not being that important.
I think that happens way more than actually finding something that works perfectly right away and then trying to find all the other copies for it. Instead, you find the opposite of, this doesn't work at all, but I see where it would work if I had something different.
Sure. Well, I've got a couple examples of that to use that Arden SCR equipment deck. Hammer of Nazan is a really good card, and it's not a cheap card either because people run it in a lot of decks. It gives your creature +2/+0, it gives it indestructible, and it equips for free when it comes into play. But what I found out was when I'm playing an equipment deck that has like 7 or 8 swords and commander's plate in it, all of which give protection from a color, and the commander kind of has ward that makes spells cost more to target it, and I have counterspells. The two most important things in the card, which are the free equip, which Arden already has, and the indestructible, which winds up being not that important when like you can't target the commander in the first place, or I can counter it if you can. That meant I was basically spending 4 mana a lot of times to give a creature +2/+0. Like it just didn't. It's a cool card, but in that particular deck, the way that deck is configured, it just didn't almost ever do what I wanted it to do. Similarly, I ran Godsend in the first version of that deck, which is an equipment from way back in Theros block. It gives a creature +3/+3, so that's good. And it also exiles anything that blocks that creature. But when my commander has evasion baked in terms of flying and protection from a color, nothing was blocking it. Like very rarely is blocking ever an issue for me to exile it anyway. So again, I'm spending mana to give a creature +3/+3, and there's just better ways to do that most of the time. But on paper, when I built that deck, I'm like, yeah, I'm running Godsend. That's an awesome equipment. Yeah, I'm running Hammer of Nazan. That's an awesome equipment. But until I played it, I just didn't realize that the keywords on those cards in my particular deck just didn't do very much.
So another thing that I find after like my first, 6 or so games with a deck is I still have to tweak my mana base.
Yeah.
Archidect, Tapped Out, Moxfield, whatever your site of choices, they have those pip calculators and your mana, distribution graphs. I don't like those. Because they don't take into account for like real life gameplay.
Sure.
So like I always tend to, whether it's, I need an additional land. I started at 36 and maybe 37 is just gonna, be that perfect number, so I add a land. Or, hey, I'm running a pretty even split between swamps and plains for my basics. Maybe we should add, maybe we need to tilt the curve one way or the other. I've definitely done that plenty of times in almost all of my decks, where I either have to change how many of one source I'm running versus the other, or take out a utility land, or add a utility land. That's something I definitely recognize after getting the first few reps in of the deck.
I don't usually run into that issue with my mana base, to be honest with you. That's one of the few things that, from drafting and doing like sealed stuff that I learned, is how to calculate that on the fly, easy to do, it takes years to do it, but, you figure that out very fast. The big thing I look for, though, when you're talking about, like, your mana pip stuff is, you may get that where, like you're talking about online, so you have 100 mana pips in red, and you have 100 mana pips in black, and you're like, oh, well, that's an easy swap, I'm going to have perfect split. But then if you actually look at the deck, because it doesn't tell you that when it distributes it, that, 8 of my cards have 5 mana pips in black or something like that on the card itself. Whereas all my red cards only have 1 mana red pip. So you honestly need more of that black mana compared to the red mana. So that's where I sit there and look at it when I do something like that, is how that goes together. And that's why I usually don't have an issue with that.
Well, I definitely notice this as well. Where I tend to notice it tends to be in counterspell decks especially, or decks that run counterspells, I should say. So when I first built that Arden and SCR deck, I didn't put an original counterspell in it, because I have one more Azorius deck. I have a Sphinx tribal deck where I don't run the original UU counterspell. Because the way that deck works, I don't oftentimes have that much free blue mana, because almost every Sphinx in that deck is at least 2 blue to cast, if not 3 blue. So if I want to cast a Sphinx and then leave counterspell mana up, it's really difficult to just always have like 4 or 5 blue mana available to do that with, to cast a Sphinx and leave mana up, and then or do something else, right? So in that deck, I was not running counterspell, and as a result, I just like kind of accidentally didn't do it in that Arden SCR deck either, where it's much easier to leave blue up. So I was running, I can't remember what I had in that slot, negate or something, and I hit a situation pretty quickly where I think someone cast an Elish Norn that I didn't want in play.
Oh, you just negate that anyways. You're like, no, I negate that spell.
Right. And see if
I negate your turn. Game over.
I should have. Should have tried that. But I was like, oh man, I wish I could have killed that. I wish I had a counterspell, not a gate. And then I'm looking and I'm like, I could easily have cast that for blue. And then I started paying attention. How often am I blowing a ton of blue mana? Not very often at all, in part because there's so much colorless equipment in that deck and colorless, between mana rocks and equipment and whatever. It's just super easy to spend the white mana if I have it, or colorless mana or whatever, and leave my blue available for a counterspell, that it was just not a problem. So I swapped that negate out for a counterspell and have never had an issue since then. But in other decks, and I'll use another deck with counterspells, my Kedison Crom deck, it is impossible to keep double blue up. Because I'm doing so many things, particularly not even because it's blue, because when I'm attacking somebody in the way that deck works, I want to drop a bunch of instant speed combat tricks to deal a ton of damage. That means I use like all of my mana plenty of times during that Alpha Strike turn. Leaving you up to have a counterspell free is not at all viable. So I found myself running things like Deflecting Swat, which is much more narrow. I can't stop someone's Elvish Norn or their board wipe or anything with a Deflecting Swat. But if someone goes to kill my creature when I'm trying to do that big Alpha Strike turn, I can push that to the side. Or I can spend 1 red mana on a Bolt Bend to retarget the removal spell onto something else or whatever. So in that deck, I found being able to Pact of Negation something or Bolt Bend it away from Kedison Crom is way more important to how that deck plays than being able to just hard counter spell. It's kind of the opposite of the SUR and Arden deck. And I never would have came to either of those two conclusions in either of those two decks until I just sat down and just like played that first, 4 or 5 or 6 games or more even, and got a feel for how those mana pips in that deck worked.
Well, that leads me into something then for that. You're talking about counterspells, for instance, and that's all instant speed play.
Yeah.
And a thing that I look for big time when I'm playing too is like, how does this deck want to play? Do I want to be doing everything on my turn, or do I want to be leaving up for other people's turns? And if the deck is leaning more towards you want to be sitting back and reacting to things, then you can put in more of your instant speed removal. You can put in more instant speed draw or other stuff like that, because you're just going to be more of a reaction deck. Whereas the other, coin is then you get the sorcery speed aspect of it. And then you just need to keep in mind that, I may have an instant speed spell, but my deck wants to play at sorcery speed, so I don't care that's instant. I'm just going to jam this at sorcery speed.
And that's just the kind of thing I think you need to get there and just grind a deck out to get a feeling for it. To use that Arden, use an example of that, Chris. During one of my initial iterations of that Arden SUR deck, I had a Trash Captain, Raph Capashen in the deck.
Yes!
Just because there's so many historic spells in the deck between equipment and things like that, like, so I can cast my commanders at flash, I can cast all these equipment at flash, but like it just didn't matter really because I had to equip that stuff anyway. It's not like you can flash an equipment in and immediately equip it for the most part. I needed to use Arden's ability to do it before combat, and I couldn't do it as a combat trick. Like if you could do it at any point in time, then you could maybe flash something in and equip it when someone declares a block they thought they had you, and like, nope, I got you back because I flashed this in. But it doesn't work that way either. Arden has to do it during that window before you attack. And luckily, I figured that out just kind of like goldfishing the deck. So I goldfished it enough to catch that one. But that's the same thing. Like, had it been in the deck, I would have, or had I not goldfished it, I would have very quickly realized that Wrath is just a 3/3 that occasionally I could flash in Mana Rocks, I guess, and avoid someone's Bane of Progress they cast because I was waiting till end of turn or whatever. But very often it just didn't matter at all in that deck.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's something you got to sit down and actually play to figure out how you want that to work.
One I just ran into this week with that Jury deck, because it's like a week old right now. I've had that deck. I'm running a bunch of Altar's Reap, kind of like sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards effects in there, because I'm like, well, if I'm going to be sacrificing Jury regularly to deal damage to people, I might as well draw cards off it. So there's an Altar's Reap and a Costly Plunder, a Deadly Dispute, a Village Rites. There's a handful of those things in there.
Wow, that seems like a lot.
Well, that was the problem I ran into. I had a couple more than that even. The deck also only has 14 creatures.
So if I see a problem right there.
Exactly. But I didn't really like bump on that until I played the deck and realized, if I'm not ready to cast Jury right now, or not ready to sacrifice Jury just yet, like say Jury's at 4 power and I am just not ready to turn him into a 14/14 or something to dome somebody, then I'm holding an Altar's Reap and a Deadly Dispute that do me no good, because I also don't want to destroy that Academy Manufacturing play or something. Like, that's not a good sacrifice target. Maybe the Doxic Extortionist will be out, and like, okay, that's done its work, I can kill that. But yeah, I found I had too many of those effects and not enough creatures that consistently use those effects. So I scaled down. I still have 4 of them in the deck, but I scaled way back and put in a couple of just traditional draw spells rather than trying to rely on those when there was just too many situations where I couldn't cast them.
Yeah, that makes sense completely.
Any other first couple of game things you guys find or tweak or look for here when you play?
I guess the big thing that I notice right away when I play, like I don't notice it quite as much when I'm goldfishing, but when I actually play against people, is the number disparity between your permanence and your spell base. Like I've seen that in like we'll take for instance my Dragon's Approach deck, because it's one of my newer decks, is the spell base is much higher than the creature base. So you got to really like play slow, play efficient to get, because your creatures are valuable resources. So you can't just willy-nilly jam a creature out there, especially in an early game when everyone's got a handful of removal. You got to wait until a couple of pieces are played before you do something like that. And you don't notice that until you actually sit down and play a few games with it.
Yeah, figuring out a deck's tempo is definitely something that you can take a guess at, okay, this is going to be an aggro deck. I'm playing Rugrat. It's a 0 drop. It's going to be going pretty quick. But for the most part, you just have to sit down and get a feel for whether that deck, this deck is much grindier than I thought. This deck is much faster than I thought. You just got to get reps in sometimes, I think.
Yeah, and then you can take it even farther. After you get those reps in, like if you are that fast aggro deck, then you can look at more aspects of the deck of, okay, so what makes this fast and how can I make it better at that speed that it needs to be played at?
Another one I kind of watch for pretty quickly that becomes apparent is whether the deck maybe creates a bad experience for your opponents. And the recent one that jumped out at me was when I built my Athreos Pestilence deck. It could kind of create soft locks where it put people in a position where they couldn't really play creatures, but I couldn't necessarily kill them either. like, okay, anything you drop, I'm going to kill with a Pestilence because I have, Winds of Wrath out or something. I think that's the card, right? No, Death Pits of Wrath. That whenever a creature takes 1 point of damage, it dies. So basically turns everything into Death Touch. But I didn't have enough mana to easily, or I didn't have protection from Pestilence myself, so I couldn't start putting 10 mana per turn into a Pestilence because it would kill me too. So I had to then tweak some knobs on that deck to make sure that when I got in that position to use a Pestilence, it was much easier to kill people and to make sure I didn't get killed. To push the game to an end versus put the game in a position where no one can do anything for 4 or 5 turns until I figure out how I can finally end things. So that's one that I definitely keep an eye on now, is to make sure the deck doesn't create situations that just aren't enjoyable for other people to sit there across from.
I've never actually ran into that before. I've had people complain about playing against my Mogus deck, but I just point out the simple fact of, hey, my life total is still lower than yours right now because I'm hurting myself just as much, so you can't really complain about it. That game ends quick.
That deck ends things quickly. Worst case scenario, the game's just going to end. How about you, Max? Is that something you've run into at all?
Oh, for sure. I think that my Brago deck is somewhat similar to your Athreos deck, where it creates slightly harder locks than that deck does. And it's all about, trying to figure out how to win. So that's why I started adding, Approach of the Second Sun, because, it's not a fun way to win, but it also wins the game.
Right.
I also, making sure everybody has a good time is definitely worth acknowledging in those first few games you're playing, just because, time's valuable, and you don't want anybody who can maybe only plays 2 games a night and you waste 3 hours in one game because you can't close it out or something like that.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I took apart my Teysa Orzhov Scion deck originally, because the way I had it built, making tokens and sacrificing, reassembling skeletons to make more tokens and things like that, it just took super long turns. And unless I had a Cathars Crusade out or a Divine Visitation or something, it was really hard to punch through enough damage to kill people. So I would take long turns sacrificing that, Bloodghast or something, and then I'd bring it back into play and play a land, sacrifice it again and bring it back, and then do something else to get it back and make 6 or 7 tokens or something. and then I couldn't swing with him that turn, and then maybe someone would board wipe or something, and it'd come back to me, and I'd fiddle around again and make a bunch of tokens and not be able to attack, or if I attacked, I'd do like 8 damage, which, isn't enough to kill somebody. And it just was a deck that made me take really long turns the way it was built. You can obviously build that deck in ways that aren't that way, but like the way I wanted to play it, it just took long turns, and I never felt comfortable making everyone watch me mess around that long and then not be able to put a game away.
I love watching people do that because I try to watch where their play mistakes are.
I'm sure I made plenty in that. Absolutely.
The longer of a turn that you take and the more interaction and stuff that you have going on with your deck, the more mistakes you make. And then I just sit back and just chuckle to myself like, haha, you missed that one.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it can be fun to watch, but I would say on average, most people, like, particularly if you don't know somebody, if it's a stranger, like it's one of your friends, it can be kind of fun. If it's a stranger, it just gets repetitive, I think. So I try to at least keep an eye on that kind of thing as well.
Okay.
Any other specific like ins or outs you guys are looking for?
So like I try to think, when I first built Tuvasa, those first few games, it was based off a budget list, and it was one of those like, I realized, and this kind of goes back to draw, you run out of gas, or maybe you have too much gas, because Tuvasa is a draw engine. So like, I think what I really try to do in those first few games is figure out the pacing of the deck, and not just how it plays, but like how fast could it play, or how slow could it play, just because you never know. There's those games where you bring your aggro deck, and it's still a 15, 18 turn game because of just all the interactions. You need to be able to realize if your deck can go, 20 turns, or can it win in 5 type of thing.
The run out of gas thing is definitely one that I think I've noticed in the past. I think back to way back when Edgar Markov came out.
Yeah.
And the first iteration of Edgar Markov I built, and I didn't keep the deck very long, but like I kind of built it not dissimilar to that Taste deck. Where I'm just going to go aggro with tokens, and I'm going to run as many 1-drop vampires as I can, because you play a 1-drop vampire, it can make you a second vampire, and then maybe I'll bounce it back to my hand or something and play it again, or I'll just keep just play a ton of vampires. Except for what I found was like by turn 4 I was just out of gas. I played the 4 1-drops I had and maybe a mana rock or something, and my hand was just empty. That deck needed so much card draw. Like I just way more than usual, because for every time I drew cards, I would just play them out again. They'd be gone. So I had to run way more than I usually run in a deck just to make that deck function. And I did take it apart pretty quickly, but like that was one where running out of gas was super apparent really, really early.
Yeah, that's I totally despise Edgar Markov decks because it's such an easy sit back and play. It's like almost like an autopilot deck, but it is really fun to just blow them out of the water when they go, like turn 4, empty their hand out, and you're like, cool, Wrath of God, bye. Don't want to see you in like 5 turns.
Well, that was when I found the card, and I think former EDH rec writer Dean Goody is the one that recommended it to me. Minions Murmurs out of back in Future Sight block. I can't remember what set it was. Time Spiral block, I guess it was. It's a card where you lose a life and draw a card for each creature you control. In Edgar, there's plenty of lifelink in that deck anyway, so who cares about losing a little bit of life? But it'd be like turn 4, I'd cast Minions Murmurs and draw like 8 cards. And lose a life, who cares? But like you just refill that card was so good in that deck because you just always had a swarm of bodies out, and okay, I'll lose 12 life and draw 12 cards, who cares? And then get it back immediately almost. So yeah, that was definitely I got bored of that deck real quick, but that's a prime example of one where you run out of gas quick and to notice it very soon too.
Yep. Another good thing to keep in mind when you are playing a new deck is listen to people's suggestions if they give them out. Like if it's someone that's, you enjoy talking to, that's a trustworthy person that's not just, insulting you as they're giving you suggestions or something like that, listen to what they have to say and take that into account, write them down, punch them in your phone or something, look up the card and see how you think it would feel. Maybe give it a try. Maybe if you're going to play another game with them, you don't have any cards on you, say, well, could I try proxying that card up and we'll see how it plays in the deck. And if they say that's fine, try jamming it in there. And if it plays awesome, you can go buy one quick then. I mean, that's always a good idea to do. I know I like to either play other people's decks or have people play my decks as well, because then they see a different aspect, different lines than what I do.
Nobody likes being wrong. And it's very easy, I think, sometimes when someone suggests something for your deck to, even if it's just unconsciously, to unconsciously take that as being told you were wrong and you made a mistake in how you built your deck. I've definitely kind of found myself defensively kind of thinking that way when someone's like, well, did you try running this? Be like, no, I'm not running that because of... And then if you think about it, you're like, that was a good suggestion. I just kind of dismissed it outright because I didn't want to have to acknowledge that I missed it. That's just a thing I think people do. But yeah, that definitely listening to input from other people, especially early on. It's one thing when you've been playing a deck for like 6 years, maybe you know that deck a little bit better than the person who's just seen you play it for one game.
Yeah.
And maybe you have reasons for not running the card they suggest. But if you've been playing it for 1 or 2 weeks, the knowledge you have of it is not much more than the knowledge somebody else has. So yeah, I tend to be you should be much more receptive, or at least open-minded to listening to people's ideas early on, especially because you yourself are still figuring out those rhythms.
Agreed. I know, now when you're coming towards the end of your deck cycle, like when your deck's, together and we're going from, alpha to beta to revise to whatever the next set is. I can't even think. Now we're in the 10th edition of the set.
Sure.
That type of thing. You start changing the deck even more. And a good example I have of this is a good friend of mine, Ben Johnston. His Snapdax deck was so tuned to the point that it wasn't fun to play anymore for him. So what he did is he went out, he dropped, a couple $100, and he bought, I think he has 36 targets now, like reanimate targets, and he's got a whole sideboard of this deck. All his creatures are out of the deck. And literally he just sets it down, upside down, grabs X amount of them, jams them in the deck, and he has no clue he's playing this game. So then the deck kind of fell backwards in its, how do we put this, the tweaking cycle of it. But it turns out how the game plays is just a different game, so it's not the same deck all the time for him.
Yeah, well, right. That's the opposite end of the spectrum, but for sure, I have in the last couple months taken a bunch of the artifact synergy stuff I was running in my Glissa the Trader deck out of that deck because. To phrase it politely, it kind of got its head so far up its own butt regarding trying to do artifact recursion stuff in addition to being a Death Touch deck that it was just I just couldn't make it play the way I wanted it to play. And I'm like, it's just a creature deck. I'm just running a bunch of Death Touch creatures and smashing face, and maybe that's fine. So I yanked a bunch of things out, and it's up to, I want to say, 24 Death Touch creatures now, and there's less triggers to worry about missing, and I can just smash creatures into people, and it's just more fun to play right now because, again, I had overdone that deck over the course of 7 years of tweaking it and trying different things, and just simplifying things made it go so much better.
Yep. Yeah, I would also...
For sure. You can absolutely overdo that, particularly over a long enough timeline, for sure.
Yep. I would also suggest not giving up on your new deck, neither. It may feel, oh, this is horrible. I hate this. This deck isn't working the way that I wanted it to. Just take a breather, sit down and look at it as, everything we suggested about where is it not working then, and try to make it work from there. Even if you have to change the whole game plan, because I've done that with a few of my decks, like my Dragon Approach deck, for instance. I had 7 mass land destruction spells in the deck, and I took them all out because it actually hindered me more than I thought it would. So I just it was an awesome idea. It seemed cool, and as soon as I tried to do it, I'm like, yeah, this is not working out for me any more than anybody else, so I pulled them all. And, sometimes you just gotta kind of choke on the bullet or whatever the phrase is or whatever, and, just dial it back.
Well, I mean, one thing that I have definitely done where I've a new set's come out and I've put whatever new card I want to try into a deck, and then, 2 weeks later, the next set comes out. Or 2 months later, whatever it winds up being.
2 weeks. No, 2 weeks is correct.
Yeah. And you go to make changes to the deck, and you're like, well, this card hasn't done anything for me, the one I added, previously. And pull that out. And you're like, well, it hasn't done anything because I haven't drawn it yet. So you're preemptively wanting to yank the card out from the deck despite having not even seen it or seen it once or something. You could do that with a deck that's a single card, but you can absolutely do that with a deck where you're like, this deck has just been trash. Well, yeah, but you've played it 3 times. If you just built it, give it a few reps before you give up on it. Maybe you just happen to run into terrible matchups for how the deck plays, or you didn't do a good job shuffling it after you put it together, and that's part of your problem too. So your first game was terrible because of that, and that is going to mentally influence you. Just who knows? But Yeah, I agree. Don't give up on a deck too soon. You got to get a few reps, and then start making those few tweaks that we talked about, and see if that fixes the problem before you just assume it's just not playable.
Yeah, that shuffling thing is quite amusing. I'm actually thinking of a story. This about 3 weeks ago. I had a Modern player I was sitting next to, and he was playing Mono Green Tron, and he kept asking me because I used to play Mono Green Tron a lot. He's like, "How do I keep from mulliganing so much?" And I looked him square in the face and just stone-faced at him. I'm like, "You need to shuffle better." Because there's literally nothing else I can do for you aside from say that.
Well, I think this was even before I played with you guys, when I was just playing like 1v1 Commander with my friend Frank when we first started. And I had thrown together an Aurelia, the War Leader Angel deck that was not good. But the first night I put it together, we were playing, and I played probably 3 games with him, and I could not, like, my mana base was, I could not get enough mana to cast anything. I just could not draw lands. And I was super mad at the deck, and I was going to take it apart. I'm like, I don't know what it is, but what I've built wrong here, but I just couldn't get enough mana to make anything happen. After, like, 2 days later, I'm at my computer desk doing something, and I just happened to notice, like, sitting offside of my there was a stack of cards face down. It was all the basic lands from the deck. I had sleeved up 14 basic lands and never shuffled them into that deck. So I was playing with a 86 card deck that was only running, 22 lands or something.
Oh,
so yeah, that's why I couldn't.
For all you listeners out there, I just want to let you all know that's not how you're supposed to cheat. Because, right. That's not helping you at all.
But, like, I was ready to not play that deck anymore. I was mad because I couldn't draw lands. Well, because there wasn't any lands in the deck. I only had, like, half the land base I should have had. That's obviously an extreme example. But, like, yeah, I was mad at the deck for not performing without, like, looking for a reason, first of all, about why it wasn't performing. So.
Yep, and that's why I tell people, ask suggestions from people, Don't hound people for, like, oh, like, you got your experienced players in the shop, like, oh, what would you do? What would you do? What would you do? It's more of a, hey, I'm having an issue with this. Do you have the time to tell me what I'm doing wrong type of deal, Mm-hmm. Be nice about it. And usually people will give you little suggestions and go from there.
For sure. All right. I think that is going to wrap up episode 282 of Commander Central. Thank you very much to Max and Chris for joining me here today. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show, as always, is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find him at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.